Today's book is Living My Life by Emma Goldman, or in other words, Emma Goldman's autobiography. Now, this is part of my scripted book review series, in which I go through my archives of old books I've reviewed on the blog and see if I can make them into YouTube videos. This is back in 2005, so running a little bit on an old memory here. But yeah, I'll just kind of talk in general about it before I kind of go back and read what I wrote. This book I stumbled upon in the library when I was in Japan, in Gifu Prefecture. They had a small English section in their library, and believe it or not, this was there. Now, I was self-identifying as an anarchist at the time. I think I probably still am, although I'm probably past that point in my life where I kind of cling to labels and maybe have kind of an eclectic view of my own politics now. I don't know. I haven't thought it through. Anyways, point is, I was a young radical at the time, and I knew who Emma Goldman was from my history classes, but I didn't know that she had an autobiography until I stumbled upon it in the library. And I thought, oh, great. Oh, this is cool. Because I was kind of very interested in Emma Goldman's life anyways. Now, if memory serves, this thing was huge. It was like 2 volumes and 2 big volumes. But I was very happy to kind of find it in the library. And I checked it out. And it was just absolutely fascinating reading. And I was very enthusiastic for a long time. I was reading it. I was talking to people, like when you're reading a good book and you want to talk to everyone about what you're reading. I got a couple of blog entries out about it, and then I never finished it. I don't really remember how far I got. I was, I think, well over halfway through. Why did I never finish it? Well, like a lot of books that you never finish, it's not like you say to yourself, right, I'm going to stop reading, I'm not going to finish this. What happens, right, is you will you're reading it every day, and then you're reading it every other day, and then maybe you're reading just a few pages a week, and then you don't really make a decision to stop reading it, but it just kind of gradually peters out. And it was a library book. Now, in Japan, they don't have fines for late library books, and I took advantage of this. I just took the books for as long as I wanted. I'm not proud of it, but that's what I used to do back in those days. But at a certain point, I think I was leaving Gifu Prefecture, and at that point, I really needed to give the book back, and I think that was the point when I kind of came to the realization I was never going to finish it. And again, it's a huge book. It's 2 volumes, 2 big volumes if memory serves. But the parts I did read before I kind of petered out and kind of got distracted by other things and eventually had to return the books without reading them, the parts I did read were absolutely fascinating. Emma Goldman really had an absolutely fascinating life, and she's a good storyteller. Like, she tells the stories well. So, yeah, let me just kind of go over kind of what's in the book. And I'm going to assume that maybe somebody watching this doesn't know much about Emma Goldman's life, so I'll kind of tell about it. She was a Russian Jew who immigrated to the U.S. with her family at a very young age. In fact, the edition that I got in Gifu Library was published under like the Jewish American series or something like that. It was not originally. It was, well, I don't know how it was originally published. This wasn't the original 1930s edition. This was a republication under a publisher which was publishing a bunch of books by famous Jewish Americans. So she and her family immigrated to the U.S., I believe, to kind of escape persecution. There were a lot of kind of Russian Jews immigrating to the U.S. around that time. And she kind of grew up in kind of a radical environment, kind of labor movement. She talks in the beginning of the book about kind of childhood memories of the Haymarket martyrs, these kind of 8 radicals who were hanged in Chicago in connection with a riot that had gone off there. She got involved in the anarchist movement, was under the tutelage of another immigrant. I think this was a German one called Johann Most. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. Who had a newspaper set up and apparently was quite in love with Emma Goldman, even though he was a few years older than her. Reading her autobiography, a lot of men were really in love with her. It's funny, I was talking about this to a friend and talking about kind of all the romances she had, and then he looked her up online, you know, Wikipedia entry or something, and he found all these pictures of Emma Goldman which don't look particularly attractive, just kind of like a old frumpy lady. So I don't know. Maybe the standards of beauty were different back then, or I think, you know, when she was very young, kind of in the 1890s, maybe she was in kind of the prime of her youth and looked very beautiful at the time. At any rate, her autobiography reads of all these men who were absolutely enamored of her. And in fact, there was a few funny passages. She was a believer in free love, as kind of the anarchists were at that point. She describes one point in her autobiography being at a party and talking about free love. And then all the guests retired to their rooms afterwards, and a man kind of started knocking on her door in the middle of the night, and she was very frightened, and she said, who is it? What's going on? He said, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you believed in free love. He wasn't an anarchist, but he had kind of heard this idea of free love and thought that was an invitation, that her bedroom door was always open. The love of her life was Alexander Berkman, who's not quite as famous as Emma Goldman is, for whatever reason. I mean, maybe because he spent the prime of his youth in jail for 17 years. But you get a very clear portrait of him in her autobiography. Both of them were intellectuals. Yeah. The portrait I remember of him from her autobiography is kind of a young man. He had a huge appetite. He would order lots of food at the banquets. I think that was her first description of him. But also kind of quite intelligent and an intellectual. Anyways, there was the two of them kind of came to fame. There was a big strike, Homestead Strike, where I think it was the steel workers were striking, and this thing just got really savage and brutal. So like, in order to kind of break the strikers, the bosses called in the Pinkertons, which was like a mob of private detectives. Well, they're not really detectives, kind of private muscle that you could hire. And they went in and went up to try and beat up the steel workers, or there was these gun battles going back and forth about it. I don't know all the details, to be honest, although the details are available if you look up like Homestead Strike on Wikipedia. So there are all these savage details coming out about all the ways these workers were being repressed. And Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were just incensed by this, 1892. So they came up with a plan to assassinate the boss of the steel mill, or the guy kind of in charge of it, whose name was Frick. I think it was Henry Frick maybe, or something like that. Henry Clay Frick. It was definitely something Frick. Anyways, now I had learned actually in my history classes at school the story that Emma Goldman prostituted herself to get money for the handgun for Alexander Berkman to shoot Frick with. Like she would sleep with men, get the money, collect enough money to buy a handgun. In her autobiography, Emma Goldman tells a slightly different version of the story. In her version, she goes out and she's all dolled up with the intention of kind of being a prostitute and sleeping with men. And the very first man she encounters, finds that she's kind of so awkward and nervous and naive about the whole thing. He says, you don't know what you're doing, do you? And he says, I'll just kind of give you the money, get off the streets, or something like that. So she doesn't actually go through with the deed in her autobiography. But at any rate, she gets the weapon, and Alexander Berkman goes to assassinate Frick. Frick actually survives the assassination, although he's very wounded. And then Berkman is kind of put away in jail for the next 17 years, where he's kind of treated horribly because, you know, he's an anarchist, and they treat anarchists horribly back in those days. And Emma Goldman was kind of, she got into some sort of legal trouble with that. Her former mentor, a lot of the anarchists kind of condemned what Alexander Berkman did, including her former mentor Johann Most, and she describes in her autobiography how she took a horsewhip and attacked Most in one of the meetings because he had condemned Berkman for it. But she became a very famous speaker, and this was kind of the 1890s, so this was like the heyday of the anarchist movement. I mean, you don't hear much about the anarchists nowadays. Well, you do kind of on the internet and stuff. But in terms of like the anarchists being a big force in the labor movement, like the working class, poorer people heavily attracted to anarchism, the 1890s was really the heyday of this. And Emma Goldman was a famous speaker, and she'd go around, and thousands of people would kind of come to listen to her speeches. Now, going around with this being kind of the heyday of the anarchist movement, we actually, right about that time, had a president, McKinley, who was assassinated by an anarchist. And his name is difficult to pronounce. It's Leon Sklodrich, I don't know, Eastern European immigrant. During this time, there had been a series of anarchist assassinations in Europe. Kind of anarchists assassinating prominent European leaders, or European kings were getting shot by anarchists. And so this had kind of come across the Atlantic via newspapers, and this guy was very inspired by it. Now, the interesting thing about this guy, and this comes through a little bit in Emma Goldman's autobiography, and then this kind of, you can find some of the rest of this out by researching on the internet. The anarchist movement wanted nothing to do with this guy. So he wasn't in any sort of leadership position. He just kind of had picked up the papers, had been inspired by these, he had a strong sense of injustice about kind of the injustice being done to poor people. He had seen in the papers that in Europe, anarchists were assassinating kings and government figures, had become very inspired by this, and had gone to a number of anarchist meetings. And apparently, he would just show up at the anarchist meetings and say, I'm interested in organizing assassinations. I'm exaggerating a little bit. But he would come up to the anarchist movement, and he would indicate an interest in violence. And he'd want to know kind of who else was interested in violence so he could kind of get in touch with them. And they all completely shunned him. I mean, not all anarchists are violent, so, some of them ideologically opposed to him, but everyone was convinced he was a cop, undercover policeman. So they not only didn't let him into their meetings, but they would kind of communicate to the other anarchist groups, like, by the way, if this guy shows up, he's a cop, don't have anything to do with him. He actually met Emma Goldman very briefly at like a train station or something like that. I believe she describes it in her autobiography. Kind of asks her if there are any books he can read to become an anarchist. She kind of gives him a reading list. And so they had that association, and that was it. And then, after he assassinated the president, by the way, this is one of those kind of little bizarre details in history that kind of doesn't get talked about enough. Or I don't know, I've always found this was kind of something that very few people know about or very few people remember. It's just a bizarre detail where one of the U.S. presidents got killed by an anarchist. I think he was walking at a fair and he just got shot by the guy. Like, how bizarre is that? An anarchist shot and killed one of the U.S. presidents. You know, it's something that kind of most people forget about. Anyways, then there was this huge crackdown on anarchists after that happened, and it came out that Emma Goldman had some association with this guy, and she was put in jail, and they wanted to kind of lock her up for longer, but they couldn't prove any kind of bigger link between the two of them. But yeah, actually, sorry. Another interesting thing to think about, something I forgot to mention earlier. I just mentioned that our U.S. president got assassinated by an anarchist. But it does kind of also raise the question, like, what is an anarchist? Because this guy wanted to get involved with anarchist groups and none of them would touch him. So he was an anarchist in the sense that he called himself an anarchist. In the sense that you could kind of wake up any day and just kind of call yourself whatever political label you wanted to, and then go out and commit some sort of horrible atrocity, and then all of a sudden everyone associated with that political label is kind of collectively guilty or kind of shares the blame for what you did. He was not an anarchist in kind of the sense that none of the people associated with the anarchist movement would have anything to do with them. They all thought he was crazy. So it does kind of bring up the question of, like, at what point do you become a member of a political movement? Do you just become a member by saying it? And are anarchists collectively responsible for what this guy did because he called himself an anarchist even though he couldn't get involved in the movement? I don't know. It's an interesting question of that kind of, with any ideology, at what point are they responsible for the people on their fringes? Because anybody could just wake up, you know, I could say tomorrow, I'm a conservative, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a socialist, I'm a monarchist, and go out and do something terrible. But if I've got no association with any of these groups, I've just kind of self-identified, does that make the group responsible? I don't know. Sorry, I'm going off on tangents. So that was quite interesting. That was in Emma Goldman's autobiography. Then when we get to World War I, that was interesting because Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were among the socialists and anarchists who were against the war and were trying to organize resistance to the draft. So they were locked in prison during that point. And then after that, they got deported to Russia, and Russia had had the revolution. So they were back in Russia meeting with Lenin and Trotsky, and then they became disillusioned with Russia. So they left Russia, and Emma Goldman, they both wrote separate books. Emma Goldman wrote My Disillusionment with Russia. Alexander Berkman wrote a different book, which I forget the name of it, some sort of similar title. So just a fascinating story. So many fascinating events in her life. Highly recommend this book, this autobiography, if you come across it. I regret not finishing it myself, although I read at least half of it, and it's in 2 volumes, so I knocked at least 1 volume out. If I ever come across a copy again, I'm going to try and buy it and try and read it. I don't see copies on the bookshelves nowadays. Of course, it's all online, you know, Internet Archives, it's in the public domain. You can get the whole thing online, but I hate reading long stuff online. Anyways, while I was reading the book in 2005, I got 2 blog entries out of it. They're both kind of dealing with it tangentially. So to explain about the first one, this is something I was reading Emma Goldman's autobiography. I was living in Japan, and I was interested in the history of anarchism. So I was researching the history of anarchism in Japan, and there were a few interesting Japanese anarchists. That's somewhat a different subject for a different time. Although, yeah, at one point, I will bring this up again, because I did read a biography of Osugi Sakai, who was the famous Japanese anarchist, but that will be a different review. one of the things that I remember coming up is in the 1910s, I believe, there was an anarchist plot in Japan to assassinate the emperor. Or 1920s. They were going to assassinate the emperor. They were planning to assassinate the emperor, and they actually did assassinate a few government officials in the 1920s, the anarchist movement in Japan, before like the authorities clamped down on them and arrested everyone or executed all of them. Now, I remember thinking to myself, your initial reaction to that is like, yeah, more violence associated with the anarchist movement. You know, it's a pity it's so violent. But then I was thinking, and this is just one of those thoughts that comes to you, I thought, well, of course, this was the 1920s. It was only, 15 years later that the U.S. was at war with the government of Japan. And the U.S. did more than assassinate just a few government officials and the emperor. This was like a massive war, which had lots of bombings of, Tokyo and Gifu City and a lot of other places, and culminating, of course, with 2 nuclear bombs. Now, you want to talk violence. That's violence. And so I was thinking how ironic it is that we, talk about all the violence in the anarchist movement, but then this kind of total war against Japan, or the total war against Vietnam, or, the Iraq war, which was happening while I wrote this. That's just kind of business as usual, done by kind of nice gentlemen politicians, but the anarchists are the crazies. It just kind of seemed, it was one of those moments where it kind of clicked, like how bizarre our perception of the world is. So I wrote a post kind of exploring that. Now, it's interesting when you kind of look back on something you've written 10 years ago or so, because you do kind of, a little bit of distance helps you to see the flaws in your argument clearly. I think one of the flaws in my argument is, to a certain extent, it's true. It is kind of bizarre. It is kind of bizarre, the disproportion in violence between kind of what governments do and what anarchists do, and yet it's the anarchists who are considered the ones who are the violent ones. But the flaw in that argument is the reason we perceive anarchists as violent is because the anarchists kind of make no secret of it. They come out, propaganda of the deed, a thing kind of in the 1890s, at least under some interpretations, was openly advocating assassination. Now, governments don't openly kind of advocate warfare. I mean, they do it, but that's just kind of like a by the by. That's not their main political philosophy. So that's why I think the kind of brunt on anarchists to kind of explain or to kind of deal with this perception of violence is kind of much greater, because it's forefronted more in the philosophy, at least potentially. Now, sorry, I should make this disclaimer, not all anarchists. A number of anarchists are pacifists. But to the extent that this exists as a prominent part of anarchist philosophy, that's why that perception is there. Anyways, I wrote about that for a post, incorporating that with some of the stuff I got from Emma Goldman's autobiography. So, I'll quote a few things here. In her book, Goldman describes the attempted assassination of Henry Clay Frick in 1892 by her lover Alexander Berkman, for which Emma provided the money for the gun. Emma Goldman defends this with the following quotation: "Did not the ends justify the means? Our end was the sacred cause of the oppressed and the exploited people. It was for them that we were going to give our lives. What if a few should have to perish? The many would be made free and could live in beauty and in comfort. Yes, the end in this case justifies the means." And in fact, the ends justify the means appear several times in Goldman's book. Now, I think this quotation, when you read it, is just chilling to kind of put it so baldly there, the ends justify the means. Although, to be fair, when she wrote that, well, she wrote her autobiography in the 30s, but she was trying to describe her thought process in 1892. And in 1892, perhaps the stakes were a little bit lower than they are now, right? I mean, when you hear the ends justify the means nowadays, you think of all the terrible things that have happened in the 20th century, right? The atomic bombs, the World Trade Center attacks in the 21st century, kind of all the terrorist attacks in the 20th and 21st century, kind of the technology and bombs and suicide airplanes and all this have made it very scary. Machine guns, gun massacres, you know, all these automatic, semi-automatic guns that can wipe out like 20 people in 30 seconds. All this technology has made it very scary to consider what a fanatic could do who believed that the ends justify the means. In 1892, I mean, they had guns, but like that guns were not quite as scary there. You could get off kind of one shot. And that's why this assassination of Henry Clay Frick did not work in the first place, because Alexander Berkman kind of got off his one shot and then he wasn't able to get off another shot. You know, nowadays, of course, he'd walk in there with like a semi-automatic gun and kind of take out 20 people. But yeah, in those days, what one fanatic could do was a lot less. Nevertheless, in Emma Goldman's book, she does kind of evolve as she goes through time. So she kind of starts off describing her mindset in 1892, and then she describes how she kind of gradually came to realize that maybe this assassination attempt was not kind of the best tactical thing. If memory serves, she never comes to the point where she full out repudiates it and says, "I'm sorry, we shouldn't have done this, this is wrong." I could be wrong about how I'm remembering this. But she does seem to evolve on it over time. Sorry, another tangent I'm going to go off on here. Aside from like the moral aspect of like taking violence into your own hands, there's also a tactical aspect here. And this came up. I was living a few years after this, after I had read Emma Goldman's autobiography. I was living in Australia, and I went to a conference that they had on the university campus where there was a socialist group who was putting on a workshop about socialism versus anarchism and trying to argue that anarchists were completely nuts and that it was all wrong. And to be fair, they had some good points. One of the points they mentioned was this assassination attempt and the Homestead Strike. Whereas before Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman attempted to assassinate Henry Frick, the strikers, excuse me, the strikers had widespread support from the general public. After this assassination attempt, they lost a lot of that support, and that was part of the reasons that the strike collapsed and that the workers did not get a clear victory in this case. So tactically it backfired, and the point the socialist guys were making is that this was completely undemocratic. I mean, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman did not kind of consult with the strike leaders and kind of coordinate tactics and stuff like that. They just kind of came down in. I mean, they weren't even kind of living in the area at the time, I think. They just kind of traveled down in, showed up, and just tried to kind of take it into their own hands. So the fact that it tactically backfired on them and the fact that it was undemocratic was something that got brought up, and I thought that was, yeah, a fair point. So anyways, in the original post I wrote, I go through some more stuff. And then talking about Emma Goldman at the time when McKinley was assassinated. So I said, there was widespread repression of anarchists after the assassination